This video was brought to you by Nebula. When the Netherlands announced a new package of asylum reforms last month, one of their proposals was the creation of a so-called mini-Schengen zone with like-minded and surrounding countries. Around the same time, amid rising concerns about the security of the EU's borders, Germany made a unilateral decision to reintroduce land border controls with its neighbours, and Hungary even threatened to bus migrants that had entered the EU illegally to Brussels. All of this has prompted discussion in the European media about the future of the Schengen area, and whether the current model is failing. So in this video, we'll explain the current Schengen crisis, what mini-Schengen zones would actually look like, and whether they could really work. Before we start, if you're interested in global alliances and groupings like Schengen, then you might like our brand new poster, Every Alliance Explains, which shows, in slightly confusing detail, how every country interacts with each other. It's available by clicking the link in the description, and for a limited time, you can get 20% off with code Schengen. Anyway, let's get into explaining the Schengen area first of all. In 1985, a breakthrough agreement on free movement was signed between 5 of the 10 members of the EEC, the EU's predecessor, near a village in Luxembourg called Schengen. It proposed the gradual abolition of checks at borders between the member states, allowing Europeans to easily work, travel, and trade between different countries. In other words, enshrining the EU principle of freedom of movement. Then, in 1990, a supplementary convention proposed the complete abolition of internal border controls and the establishment of a common visa policy, with the latter being incorporated into EU law by the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1999. The Schengen area now covers the whole of the EU, apart from Cyprus and Ireland, as well as several non-EU states. Those being Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, and the Vatican City. However, over the past decade, concern has been growing over the effectiveness of the EU's external and internal security measures, spurred on by events like the 2015 migrant crisis and a steady rise in irregular migration via the Mediterranean, and a rise in organised crime inside the bloc, facilitated by freedom of movement. A recent Eurobarometer survey published this month showed that while roughly 2/3 of the EU population think that the current security measures at Schengen's external border are effective, 27% think they're ineffective, with the countries most likely to say they're ineffective being Slovenia, France, Austria, and Germany. Anyway, due to anxieties about security and migration, a number of Schengen zone countries have begun temporarily introducing their own internal border controls, which they're able to do under EU law in the event of a serious threat to public policy or internal security, provided it's a last resort measure and an exceptional situation. Paradoxically though, these exceptional situations seem to be becoming the new normal, with 6 Schengen countries, Norway, Austria, Germany, Denmark, France and Sweden, having effectively extended their temporary measures since about 2015. And while it might seem like a good idea for the individual countries, in effect, introducing national border checks undermines the very nature of Schengen, thereby forcing other countries to start implementing them too. Using migrants as an example, if Austria refused to accept migrants turned away at the German border, Germany's other neighbours would probably do the same, and so a domino effect begins. Here's where the idea of mini-Schengens come in. As we mentioned in the intro, the Netherlands is the most recent country to suggest a mini-Schengen zone with, quote, like-minded and surrounding countries. But this isn't actually a new proposal. The phrase mini-Schengen was first coined in the 1990s, when a handful of Balkan countries suggested creating their own mini-Schengen to prove to the EU that they could do it and accelerate accession, ultimately culminating in the open Balkan zone, comprising of Albania, North Macedonia, and Serbia. However, the first time a mini-Schengen zone within the EU was floated was 2015, when, during the migrant crisis, the Netherlands floated a similar idea which would include Austria, Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but it didn't go anywhere at the time. More recently, in January 2024, MEPs from Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece also suggested their own mini-Schengen, geared around improving tourist flows between the three countries. But none of the relevant national governments were all that keen. The Bulgarian Prime Minister even called the idea illegal and contrary to EU legislation. And it's worth mentioning that at the time, Bulgaria and Romania weren't even part of the Schengen area yet. So what's actually the rationale for these mini-Schengens? Well, they're sort of intended as a middle ground between Schengen as it was originally intended and the reality that's currently emerging, where more and more nation-states are reasserting their national borders. And thanks to that domino effect we talked about earlier, there's a risk that Europe just returns back to the 20th century status quo, with checks at all national borders. This would be both politically and economically regressive. When there was some debate over the effectiveness of Schengen back in 2015-2016, the European Parliament published a paper detailing the economic impact of suspending Schengen, with the total annual cost at the time estimated by the Commission to be between 5 and 18 billion euros, based on the cost of additional border controls, systematic border checks, and the resulting cost of the loss of business due to delays and logistical hurdles. In essence, mini-Schengen zones are a symptom of the fact that many member states just don't trust each other equally. Some EU countries, for instance, have floated excluding Hungary from Schengen because it has a controversial work visa scheme with Russia and Belarus. The problem here is that other EU countries just don't trust Hungary's migration policy to not, say, let in Russian spies, so they don't like opening their borders to Hungary. Similarly, Denmark is considering closing its borders with Sweden because it essentially doesn't trust Sweden to deal with its ongoing crime crisis. And this is why mini-Schengens are always framed around mutual trust and similar interest. It's basically about countries with similar migration or security policies who are therefore happy to keep their mutual borders open. But are they actually a good idea? Well, proponents of these mini-Schengens, like the Dutch, argue that they're a way to preserve the spirit of Schengen and to protect the economic benefits, while intra-European trust is at a low, and Europe is trying to figure out a solution to increased migration flows. But while it might be true that mini-Schengens are in some sense better than a total collapse of Schengen, at least from the perspective of anyone who's pro-Schengen, they have a whole load of problems, which is why they almost always get shot down by other EU member states. For starters, until Schengen is actually dead, it makes more sense to defend it in its totality, rather than immediately move to a suboptimal middle ground. Second, mini-Schengens would almost definitely make intra-European trust worse. After all, the optics of the rich Northern European mini-Schengen, led by the Netherlands and Germany, excluding smaller European states, would obviously stoke intra-European resentment. And thirdly, mini-Schengens would just put more pressure on certain countries outside of these zones, and countries with more exposed borders would be forced to carry more of the burden. Italy, for instance, would be forced to deal with even more asylum seekers if its border with Austria, which is how many asylum seekers eventually get to Germany, was shut. This would also undermine the EU's new migration pact, which enters into force in June 2026. Nonetheless, the border control domino effect has arguably already started, and if EU member states choose to introduce their own controls, this mini-Schengen system could become a de facto reality. Speaking of border controls, one of the big topics in US politics at the moment is irregular migration across the Mexico-US border, which also featured in the vice presidential debate between Walz and JD Vance. In fact, we've been keeping up to date with everything that's been happening in the US presidential election in our fun new series, WTF USA. Each week, we dive into the online discourse, explain the politics behind the stories, and tell you if you really need to pay attention. For example, in recent episodes, we've talked about Trump's foray into the world of crypto, claims of dog eating, and AI-generated Musk memes. These might sound stupid, but they actually tell us a lot about the candidate's economic plans, the state of post-truth politics, and how the US feels about its deficit. That is to say, WTF USA brings you the wildest moments from the 2024 election, tells you the hidden political meaning behind each of them, and then if you can just ignore the chaos, or if you should follow along. New videos come out every Friday only on Nebula. That's the streaming service we've built alongside a bunch of our creator friends, and where you can find all kinds of superb content like WTF. We're super proud of WTF USA, and we hope that with your support, we'll be able to make other interesting, weird, and entertaining series with Nebula in the future. So signing up genuinely helps TLDR to grow and expand. As I say, it's not just WTF either. There's a whole bunch of other original content on the service, from creators like Real Life Law, Wendover Productions, and Neo. You can also watch every normal TLDR video ad-free on Nebula as well, and in some instances, before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click the link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $30 for a year, or $2.50 a month. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.